It's a privilege for me to be in Hayastan. My parents are from the other side. My mother's from a village north of Diyarbakir and Dikanagar, and my father is from a village near Palu, Kharpet. So when I grew up in New York, I grew up in the shadow of genocide, and I met all of these, and I knew all of these unusual characters from Yergir, which was this magical place that they talked about as if, the water was so pure, and the air was so clean, and the people were so nice. I became very interested in history, and it sparked in me a skepticism and a desire to interrogate the past, to find out why things happen. Because I would ask these old-timers, these survivors, like Madros Sarkisyan and Ardashes Israelian and all of these people that surrounded me, Sarkis Hakopian, why did the genocide happen? What caused it? And I really didn't get good answers from them, other than the Turks hated us, they're bad people, and they killed us. That's it. There was no other class or economic issue or whatever. So it made me an activist, which I continue today, just to give a little bit of a background. Now, I believe the greatest threat facing humanity, not Canadians, not French, not Italians, not Germans, not Japanese, but humanity is what is happening with the climate. And we risk at our great collective peril to ignore it or to dismiss it, as our great president, Donald Trump, has said, it is a hoax. Two things happened on November 8th. One, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. On the same day, the World Meteorological Association issued a report saying that climate change is in fact accelerating, that the earlier reports understated the speed in which the climate is changing. You've all heard about the polar ice caps melting. One section of the Arctic ice cap is the size of the state of Delaware that has broken off. These are unmistakable examples of why and how the Earth is changing in its climate. Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. Now, I don't expect you to know when that statement was made, but you might be shocked to learn that it was made in 1992, 25 years ago, by 1,700 eminent world scientists, including over 100 Nobel laureates. And what was the response from the United States, the so-called leader of the free world, and Western democracies, and Russia and China and Japan? Nothing. There was no response to this warning that was made in 1992, and of course since then the problem has only gotten worse. Having a president that believes that climate change doesn't really exist, that it is a hoax, makes it very difficult to enact the necessary legislation and to mobilize popular support. Because the only way we're going to turn this around is that not just in the United States, but all across the world, if people organize themselves to do something to stop what's happening with the climate. Diminishing fresh water supplies. I was talking earlier today about Yemen, a country that's being obliterated by the great democracy of Saudi Arabia, a very strong ally of the United States. Yemen might be the first country in the world to run out of fresh water. If you look at the UN maps, by the way, of South and West Asia, you see how many areas are considered water-stressed. Large parts of North India, for example, I've seen with my own eyes the Himalayan glaciers that have shrunk, that have contracted over the years. And I talked to people there in Nepal and in India and in Pakistan about these glaciers, and they said, yeah, they used to be this big, but now they have shrunk like this, and we have less water for agriculture. Well, how serious is that? 300 million people in the Ganges Basin depend on the water coming from the glaciers of the Himalayas. If those glaciers are contracting and shrinking, those farmers will not be able to grow enough crops to feed one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Now, I never like to quote anyone from the World Bank because I find them to be very problematic, like the International Monetary Fund and other financial instruments of the West, primarily the United States and Europe when I say the West. But there was a very smart vice president of the World Bank who in the late 1990s, I think 1997, he said, you know, years ago there was wars were fought, there was conflict over gold, and then there was conflict over silver, and then ivory. And today, the conflict is over oil, in most cases. But coming in the future, the wars will be about water and access to water. Now, I believe here in Hayastan, there are already water-stressed areas that water itself has been privatized by a French corporation. People are paying, I think, more money than they were before for water. If I'm not correct about that, please correct me. And this is an issue, as I said, West Asia in particular, so the Middle East, right, West Asia, is particularly water-stressed. Countries like, I was just in Jordan a couple of weeks ago, have acute water problems. They don't have enough fresh water. The same is true in Iraq, in parts of Syria. In fact, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons there was an uprising in Syria against the Assad regime was because the country had undergone a drought for 5 years. Many of the farmers could not farm their land, so they moved to the cities. They moved to Homs, to Hama, to Halep, to Damascus, where they could not find work or were living in not good conditions. And so they became kind of the one of the aspects of the uprising against the Assad regime. Iraq has had severe water problems as Turkey has built more and more dams on the Firat and Dajla, this Euphrates and Tigris rivers, it has cut the supply of the water supply to Iraq and to Syria, which were both heavily dependent on that water. So clearly, this issue is becoming worse because temperatures are rising, and so evaporation is increasing. You don't have to be a PhD in climatology to understand this. If you have a glass of water here and the temperature in this room reaches 50 degrees centigrade, pretty soon that water is going to evaporate. So that's what's happening, particularly in this region. Egypt is facing the same problems with dams being built on the Nile by Ethiopia, again taking water away from the crucial Nile Valley Delta, which is the breadbasket of Egypt. Now, the U.S., I think, has to play a special role because it is historically the number one polluter in the world. That has now been replaced by China, but historically, until the last year or two, the United States was the main emitter of fossil fuels into the atmosphere, contributing to global warming. The scientific evidence of this is almost 100%. It's not 100%. There are a few so-called reports and studies that have come out saying, well, it could be global warming, it's possible, but we're not quite sure. And then they'll quote some scientists saying that, these are historical patterns that occur and the weather changes from time to time. We find out that these so-called reports and studies are produced by the fossil fuel industry. Gee, what a surprise. ExxonMobil, Chevron Texaco, Shell, Getty, all of these, Total, the French oil corporation, they have been paying scientists to produce false information to sow seeds of doubt in people's minds. I mean, I think this is not only immoral for the scientists to actually make a lot of money, but it is criminal for them to produce this kind of fake science. Trump is always talking about fake news. Well, he should also talk about fake science. And that has sown doubt in people's minds. We've seen this before in the United States with the tobacco industry. For years and years they were saying, oh, cancer, tobacco causing cancer, it's possible, but we're not quite sure. They knew for sure decades ago that there was a direct link from smoking tobacco and cancer. Yet hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans have died because of tobacco. And the false propaganda that it's really not clear. There's a very good movie about this with Al Pacino called The Insider. If you want to see this, it's very well done explaining this story. There's also a new documentary out called Merchants of Doubt about climate change deniers. These so-called academics who produce, because of money, so-called studies, documents saying that climate change is not happening, that you don't have to worry about it. Well, I think we should be very worried about it. We, humanity, we are like Captain Ahab on the Pequod in the greatest American novel, Moby Dick. Are you all familiar with Moby Dick?
Yes.
Here you had this mad captain, absolutely insane, whose only goal was to kill Moby Dick because Moby Dick had cut off his leg and made him invalid in a way. And he was warned about what he was about to do, and he should not, and because of pursuing Moby Dick, the entire ship went down. There was only one survivor to tell the tale. I think a better analogy than Moby Dick, although I think that speaks more to the capitalist ethic and the capitalist desire to conquer nature. Because who was Moby Dick? She was a woman, a white woman, purity, something clean that had hurt, the captain, because the captain was attacking her. Right? The capitalist mentality is about, of course, in their DNA. It's not because these people are evil. It's in their composition, in their blood, is to make money, is to accumulate wealth, is to expand that wealth as much as possible. This is not a Marxist analysis, by the way. This is, I think, very straightforward. It's very straightforward. This is what the economic system is about, particularly in the United States. Whether that obtains here in Hayastan, that's for you to decide. Are companies getting rich off of your mineral wealth? You know the answer to that. Are they contaminating the environment and polluting it with their all of the chemicals that they inject in order to extract gold and manganese and iron ore and copper and bauxite and other minerals? You know the answer to that better than I. So we're dealing here with a system that sees nature, sees our earth as a commodity, as something to be exploited, as something to be dominated and controlled. So this is kind of male chauvinism also, machismo, out of control, to dominate the earth, to dominate our mother. We only have one planet that we know of, and we are destroying it, and it is so important that people here and around the world get involved in reversing climate change to give future generations. I'm not talking about 2250 or 2403. I'm talking about in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, people in this room are going to see catastrophes, climate change catastrophes, never before seen in the history of the world, at least in the known history. So it's so incumbent. This is not something abstract that is happening far away. And you may feel, well, here in Hayastan we live at high altitudes, and we won't be affected by rising water because we'll be on top of our mountains and we'll be safe. Everyone will be affected by climate change. You cannot rely just on the mountains. And the other, I think, analogy, which is even better than Moby Dick and Captain Ahab, is the Titanic. Now, this great ship, which was considered to be unsinkable. It was launched in Southampton, England in 1912. Some of the richest capitalists in the world were passengers. And of course, the company said nothing can sink the Titanic. It is invincible and indestructible. Well, there was this iceberg which got in the way of this arrogance and this hubris about the Titanic being unsinkable. And so in many ways, we, I will say collectively, arrogant people who think we can just continue the way we've been continuing to consume, to buy bigger and bigger cars, more and more SUVs, more and more fossil fuels pumping into the atmosphere. We think we're different, that we're going to avoid the fate of the Titanic. But the iceberg is there in front of us, and we have to pay attention. Of course, the media do a lot to distract us from paying attention. That's part of their societal role. That's part of what their job is to do, is to protect capital and the capitalist system. Until only recently have the media been giving climate change the attention that it deserves. Stories used to be on page 26 in the newspaper are now on the front page. Stories that used to come in the evening news would be, 20 minutes would pass before you would hear a story about climate change. Now those stories are coming right at the beginning. And that's because the evidence is mounting. There is more and more concern. There have been multiple international conferences from Durban to Cape Town to Copenhagen to Rio to Kyoto, most recently in Paris. And now the great American president has withdrawn U.S. support for the Paris Accord. This was a very, I think, dangerous and foolhardy move by the American president. The Paris Accord, while not perfect, at least provided a framework for the reduction of greenhouse gases and the reduction of temperatures, which must be achieved unless irreversible and unprecedented outcomes occur if the temperature continues to increase. I think it's 3.6 degrees centigrade, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Those are the minimum requirements that the Paris Treaty set out, which 195 countries, by the way, signed this agreement. Only 3 countries now are not part of it. Syria, which is in chaos. Nicaragua, because Nicaragua thought it was too weak. So for a very good reason. They said this is not enough. We have to be more aggressive. We have to take immediate action to reverse climate change. And of course, the third country now is the leader of the free world, the United States of America. We have an environmental protection agency in the United States that is supposed to look after the environment. This president has cut the budget, has proposed cutting the budget and laying off hundreds, if not, actually the number is 3,000 workers from the very agency that was set up to protect the environment. So at a time when we should be spending more money on environmental protection, the United States is busy selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and to other countries, around the world. Corporate-driven policies toward the earth as just a place to extract resources and make money must be reversed if long-term tragic consequences are to be avoided. This is what a friend of mine said a few years ago. It is no exaggeration to state without swift, dramatic, and profound changes to societal priorities, including a fundamental reorientation away from fossil fuel-based energy and profit-driven capitalistic economic growth, the generation growing up today, that's some of you, the generation growing up today will be, in all likelihood, the last to know climate stability. If humanity continues on this present course, effecting only minor technological changes over the next 10 to 20 years, civilization on anything like the current scale cannot be sustained. This was said 7 years ago by a brilliant scientist from the UK, Chris Williams, and I've done a number of programs with him. But it seems like these scientists and the ones who signed the 1,700 scientists and Nobel Prize winners who signed that 1992 declaration, it seems like they're Cassandras, that they are telling the truth of what is going to happen, but no one is listening. They're looking the other way, and it's the job of the media, one of the jobs of the media, to make this issue paramount, to make this issue clear, and to provide information and facts that are accurate, and that people can then implement the kind of change that is demanded by this situation. Now, in the US and in the capitalist system, they're very clever at offering what are called reforms, let's say. This too is a very popular term used by neoliberals. You know, we're all for reform. Yes, it sounds like a good word. But what they mean by reform is to ignore climate change predictions and evidence, and to continue with their exploitation of resources and plundering and looting of the earth because of the drive for more and more profits. That's what the real intention. And I say that the capitalists are very clever, particularly in the United States, because they give people little bits of, gadol mahatskudan, they just give them a little bit, like recycling. So you take plastic and cardboard and glass and other things, and you put them in a special box, right? And that's recycled. Or you take newspapers and also magazines and recycle them. You're encouraged to ride bicycles and to walk. You're encouraged, if you buy a car, buy a Prius or a Honda, or some car that is less using benzene, less using petrol. These are all very seductive ways for us to feel that we are doing something about climate change. But in fact, they still own the bakery, they own the flour, they own the barley, they own the wheat, they own the sugar, they own the salt. In other words, they have complete control of the system, and we are given these little things to make us feel good that we are actually doing something about climate change. And you'll notice these, I don't want to call them reforms, these techniques are very individualistically designed. They're for individuals, they're not for the communities. They're not for the city of Yerevan to undertake a bicycle campaign, to make bicycles very cheap, and to train drivers into respecting bicycles and providing bicycle lanes and things like that. That would be something collectively that could be done here that would reduce the level of pollution and the emission of greenhouse gases. So we have to be aware of these little pieces of bread that they give us while they continue with their designs to exploit. Now, before I was banned from India in 2011, I spent a lot of time in that country, and there is tremendous resistance to the corporations, to what they're doing in terms of looting and plundering resources. And I saw remarkable examples of resistance to these large corporations. Some of them are from the West. They're not just Indian corporations, but US and European corporations that want to extract mineral wealth from India. And these are people who are resisting, who don't have cell phones, they don't have mobiles, they don't have electricity, they don't have running water in their homes, they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have computers, but they have organized themselves to push back, to blockade the capitalist expansion wherever it is occurring, and to protect their land. And we just saw this, incidentally, in the United States, in Standing Rock. which was a large Indian reservation, Native American reservation, where the large oil companies, again, wanted to build pipelines to extract tar sands oil from Canada, the filthiest oil on earth, to the East Coast and to Texas, and building these pipelines. Many of the Indians are very poor. They don't have a lot of technical tools that we take for granted. They organized themselves. They had lots of allies from the Black Lives Matters movement, from feminist organizations, other organizations to support them. Unfortunately, that struggle was lost, and the pipeline is being built because Trump signed an executive order allowing that to happen. Rarely in U.S. history has a government been so enthralled by the fossil fuel industry as Donald Trump, although I must say George W. Bush comes a close second, right behind Donald Trump in catering to the desires of the fossil fuel corporations. And again, as I've been saying, it's all about profits. These are not evil people. They don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to destroy the earth. No, they wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to make money today for my stockholders. We have this system of public corporations having stocks. You can buy stocks in them. And so I am the chief executive officer of a corporation, and my duty is not to Mother Earth or to nature. My duty is to you, to provide you with money. That's why you pay me $500 million a year. That's why you give me a private jet and a chalet in the Alps and an apartment in Paris and a condo in New York. That is my job, not to worry about the environment. That's somebody else's problem. The structure of capitalism is exactly this. I have to generate profits. Otherwise, you, as the stockholders, the next time there's an election, I'm out of a job. I'm gone. You're going to hire someone else who's going to provide you with the dividends that you are counting on. So the system, we need system change in addition to climate change. The system itself is promoting this kind of destruction, and we cannot be romantic about it or simply hoping that things will change by themselves. They will not change by themselves. There's a wonderful writer for the New Yorker magazine. Her name is Elizabeth Colbert, with a K. And she has written a recent article about Miami, Florida, which is in great danger of going underwater. So you've heard about the Marshall Islands and Nauru and Tuvalu and places like that, and Fiji, and the Maldives. They are losing land to the rising temperatures, rising ocean levels. Also Bangladesh, huge population is at risk. But even in Miami, Florida, they are now facing these kinds of things, and a lot of money is being spent to build dams and dikes to prevent water from flooding the city. But just a few days ago, the BBC had a report about how much water was coming into the city of Miami as a result of rising water levels. So this is going to be a huge political issue when people start losing their homes, when they become climate refugees, where they have to migrate, like in Bangladesh, to higher elevations, or to go to India, or up in the mountains. What kind of social chaos will result because of that movement of population? So again, I think the ramifications of not addressing this problem seriously and with great resources and intention are impossible to predict. But I will say that there will be more conflict in the future around these particular issues. And obviously the global north, the United States, Canada, the rich countries, they will take measures to protect themselves. But even they, I think, will be, as Elizabeth Colbert has written in the New Yorker, even they will be affected. If parts of North Carolina, New Jersey, New York also are being affected by more and more storms, tornadoes. What is called extreme weather in the United States has become more common. Now, scientists say this is connected to global warming also, that there's not only more storms in terms of frequency, the intensity of these storms have increased also because of rising temperatures and rising sea levels. So we saw that with Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Irene, Katrina in New Orleans, which is a city almost underwater, great parts of it, indeed. So our planet is in trouble, if I may say. Our planet is in the ICU. It still has a pulse, it's still breathing, but it is in critical condition. But the political class, with some exceptions, is not addressing with urgency what needs to be done to protect our mother. Our mother is under attack. The Native American people very particularly have I don't want to romanticize their background, but had a reverence for nature, for mountains, for rivers. Even like the people I grew up with, the survivors from Anatolia, from the genocide, they worshipped mountains, trees, even streams, rivers had some sacredness. So when something is sacred, it's difficult to defile it, to dirty it, because it's holy. I'm not talking in a religious sense. It's sacred it is providing life, and it should be honored. And Native Americans, traditional peoples everywhere, had this view of nature. But again, because of the onslaught of the capitalist economic system, a lot of that has been lost over the centuries. But I think it can be regained. There's a very dynamic resistance in the United States with 350.org and other organizations that are working on solving the problem of climate change. In Europe as well, there are lots of grassroots organizations that are saying, enough, kapave, basta. We need to stop this now. We need to save our mother. Otherwise, she is going to be suffering terribly. And it was Carl Sagan, a great US scientist, who said, he called this the blue planet. He said, this is the only planet we have in the solar system which sustains life, and we should nurture and protect it. Don't you have plants? Don't you have gardens? Don't you have pets? Maybe dogs or cats. You look after them, or young children. You feed them. You make sure they're well rested. You make sure they have water. If they're children, that they have, proper clothes and, have some toys to play with. You don't ignore them. You pay attention to them. You nourish them so that they grow, so that the plants will grow, so that your garden will flourish. You're using water, making sure there's enough sunlight, or putting plants in the shade. We do all of those things. And so we need to transfer that to our mother, to Earth, to do those things to protect her from more and more violation, all in the name of, accumulation of profits. So I could continue, but I'm going to end with something that Howard Zinn once said, a great radical U.S. historian. He said, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act, and at least the possibility of saving this world. And if we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopia. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." Maybe I'll also read something from Arundhati Roy, the great Indian writer, critic of capitalism, chronicler of the environmental resistance movements in her native India. She's written extensively about these issues. Let me see if I can find her particular quote. Sorry. Okay, not there. One more. We can't talk about hope until we grasp reality. So we have to be able to identify the problem. I think, based on what I said here this evening, the problem is climate change. The climate is changing. Temperatures are rising. It's a fact. We cannot ignore it. So we have to be clear about that to grasp reality. If we don't grasp reality, then everything we do is futile. It's useless, because we are appealing to a system that can't be appealed to. But that everything requires a clear understanding of where we are. It's late in the game, she says, but there is still time. Fortunately, power has a shelf life. When the time comes, maybe this mighty empire, and she's talking about the United States, maybe this mighty empire will, like others before it, overreach itself and implode from within. It looks as though structural cracks have already appeared in the endless war on terror that has no end in sight. 20 years from now, the Americans are still going to be fighting jihadis because they are creating jihadis because of their policies. So it just goes round and around in a circle. And then because we have jihadis who are threatening us, we need more weapons. We need larger armies. We need new submarines and aircraft carriers and jet planes. And so it goes, as Kurt Vonnegut used to say, and on and on and on. And so it goes. But Arundhati Roy says, the time has come. Perhaps things will get worse and then better. Perhaps there's a small goddess up in heaven readying herself for us. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. So we have to imagine another world is possible. You have to imagine another Hayastan, a better Hayastan, where there is justice and equality, is possible. We cannot give them that. We cannot give them that. That weapon to use against us. We have to think outside the box in creative ways, and that's why, as I always say, art is very important. Writing, poetry, exhibitions, new art, media exhibitions, novels, whatever interventions you can do that will help to facilitate another world being possible, another world where nature is honored rather than dishonored, where nature is nourished and grows and heals itself, because we have inflicted enormous damage upon the earth. And it is our duty as earth citizens, not just Armenians or Americans or Canadians or Japanese, but as we are earth citizens, and this is our home, and we have to protect it. So whatever you can do here locally to promote, those kinds of ideas, I certainly encourage you. And with that, I thank you very much.